From Washington, D.C., this is Democracy Now!
I've just had an opportunity to speak with President Trump, and he, I would say to all my colleagues, has indicated he's prepared to sign the bill. He will also be issuing a national emergency declaration at the same time.
We're going to issue a national. As Congress passes a government spending bill, including nearly $1.4 billion to build 55 miles of new border barriers out of steel, Trump has vowed to declare a national emergency to get the rest of the funding he wants for his wall. We'll get response from Public Citizen President Robert Weissman, who says the move will constitute an outrageous abuse of power, perhaps the most dangerous yet by an unstable and increasingly autocratic president, he says. We'll also get response from immigrant rights activist Erica Andiola. And this Black History Month marks the 200th anniversary of the birth of the renowned abolitionist Frederick Douglass.
Well, both of my ancestors, Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, were born into slavery. And they were born into the most horrific conditions that a human being could be subjected to. But yet, through the power of education, both of my ancestors understood from a very young age that education equals freedom.
We'll speak with Kenneth Morris, Jr., the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass. He's also the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. And we'll talk to Professor Ibram X. Kendi, founding director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump's expected to declare a national emergency today to build a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border, despite opposition from Congress. On Thursday, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell announced the president planned to sign the latest spending bill, but to also declare a national emergency. The spending bill includes nearly $1.4 billion to build 55 miles of new border barriers out of steel, far less than the $5.7 billion requested by President Trump. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi condemned Trump's plan to declare a national emergency.
It's not an emergency, what's happening at the border. It's a humanitarian challenge to us. The president has tried to sell a bill of goods to American people. But putting that aside, just in terms of the president making an end run around Congress.
Several Republicans, including Senators Marco Rubio and Rand Paul, have also come out against Trump's emergency declaration. Rubio wrote, quote, "We have a crisis at our southern border, but no crisis justifies violating the Constitution." Several groups, including Public Citizen, have announced plans to sue the Trump administration once a national emergency is declared. We'll have more on the story after headlines. Amazon has announced it's scrapping plans to build a major office facility in New York City after local politicians and grassroots activists opposed the deal. Amazon had announced the project in November after New York Governor Andrew Cuomo and New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio offered nearly $3 billion in tax subsidies to build the project, which could have created 25,000 jobs. As part of the deal, New York even offered to build a helipad for Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos, who is the richest man in the world. One of the leading opponents of the deal was Democratic Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who represents parts of Queens, New York, the borough where Amazon was planning to build.
I think it's incredible. I mean, it shows that everyday Americans still have the power to organize and fight for their communities, and they can have more say in this country than the richest man in the world. If we're willing to give away $3 billion for this deal, we could invest those $3 billion in our district ourselves if we wanted to. We could hire out more teachers. We can fix our subways. We can put a lot of people to work for that money if we wanted to.
New York State project.
This is a very dangerous moment in our history, where big corporations think they have the power to tell governments what they should be doing. This is robber baron stuff. We turned away from it a century ago, and we shouldn't go back to it now. It's time for people, through their governments, to stand up and say the corporations are not the most powerful thing in this country, the governments are.
New York Times reporter J. David Goodman tweeted on Thursday, quote, "One factor that concerned Amazon executives was how activists in New York City broadened their attacks from the specifics of the deal to the company's practices far beyond the 5 boroughs on unions and working with ICE," unquote. Meanwhile, a new study by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy has found that Amazon will likely pay no federal taxes for a second year in a row, even though it reported over $11 billion in profits in 2018. Instead, the company will receive a $129 million federal income tax rebate. Denver school teachers are declaring victory after securing a nearly 12% pay raise and annual cost of living increases following a 3-day strike. Teachers returned to class Thursday after a tentative agreement was reached. Denver Classroom Teachers Association President Henry Rahman said, quote, "This agreement is a win, plain and simple, for our students, for our educators, and for our communities. No longer will our students see their education disrupted because their teachers cannot afford to stay in their classrooms," he said. This marked the 9th major U.S. teacher strike in the past year. New data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics shows more U.S. workers went on strike last year than in any year since 1986. Nearly 500,000 workers took part in a major work stoppage in 2018. On Thursday, students at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High in Parkland, Florida, and schools across the United States observed a moment of silence to remember the 17 students, staff, and teachers who were killed in Parkland February 14th, 2018, in one of the deadliest school shootings in U.S. history. One of the students who survived the shooting, Emma Gonzalez, spoke at an event in New York.
A lot of people either don't know about or forget about the trauma of gun violence, and that it doesn't only resurface on the anniversary of the event. Every day I feel the same. Every day my friends feel the same. Every day it feels like the shooting is happening again, or happened yesterday, or will happen tomorrow. For me and most of my friends, we fight our trauma by fighting against gun violence and the system that perpetrates it.
Since the Parkland shooting, nearly 1,200 children have been killed by guns in the United States. Meanwhile, a new survey from NPR and PBS has found over a quarter of parents with school-aged children say their child knows someone who's been a victim of gun violence. William Barr has been sworn in as Attorney General after the Senate confirmed him Thursday by a 54-45 vote. Barr previously served as President George H.W. Bush's Attorney General. During that time, he was involved in the pardon of 6 Reagan officials, including Elliott Abrams, for the Iran-Contra scandal. He also oversaw the opening of the Guantanamo Bay military prison, which was initially used to indefinitely detain Haitian asylum seekers. Former Deputy FBI Director Andrew McCabe has spoken out for the first time about why he ordered a counterintelligence investigation involving President Trump and his ties to Russia after Trump fired Bureau FBI Director James Comey in 2017. McCabe will appear on 60 Minutes Sunday, but an excerpt of the interview conducted by Scott Pelley has already been released.
How long was it after that you decided to start the obstruction of justice and counterintelligence investigations involving the president?
I think the next day I met with the team investigating the Russia cases, and I asked the team to go back and conduct an assessment to determine where are we with these efforts and what steps do we need to take going forward.
In the interview, McCabe also confirms Justice Department officials discuss recruiting cabinet members to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove Donald Trump from office. He also confirmed former Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein offered to wear a wire in meetings with the president. Vice President Mike Pence called on European allies to pull out of the historic Iran nuclear accord while accusing Europe of trying to undermine U.S. sanctions against Iran. Pence made the comment during a summit in Warsaw organized by the United States.
The time has come for our European partners to stand with us and the Iranian people, to stand with our allies and friends in the region. The time has come for our European partners to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal and join with us as we bring the economic and diplomatic pressure necessary to give the Iranian people, the region, and the world the peace, security, and freedom they deserve.
The European Union's top diplomat, Federica Mogherini, responded by saying the European Union still believes that upholding the Iran nuclear deal is an essential way to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. The Venezuelan government's accusing Trump's special envoy, Elliot Abrams, of threatening to deploy U.S. troops to Venezuela during secret talks between the two sides. Venezuelan officials told the Associated Press Abrams made the threat during previously undisclosed meetings in New York with Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Ariaza. During the talks, Ariaza invited Abrams to come to Venezuela to speak with President Nicolas Maduro. Meanwhile, Cuba has publicly accused the United States of moving special forces to Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, and other Caribbean islands as part of a covert plan to topple the Venezuelan government. U.S. Special Envoy Elliot Abrams accused Cuba of lying. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Ariaza announced a group of about 50 nations have joined a new coalition to oppose U.S.-backed efforts to topple the Venezuelan government.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, those so-called sanctions are not sanctions because the U.S. has no moral, no authority in order to impose sanctions to anyone. So it's in breach of this charter. So we're going to compel and to convince humanity and the world that no government in the world can take such decisions. Only the group of measures, if they were adopted by the UN organisms, by the Security Council, can be legal. The rest are unilateral actions that must be rejected by all the peoples of this world.
India is accusing Pakistan of having a direct hand in a bombing that killed as many as 46 Indian soldiers in Indian-administered Kashmir Thursday. It was the deadliest attack on Indian forces in Kashmir since the late 1980s. The deaths occurred when a car packed with explosives drove into a bus carrying Indian soldiers. The group, Jaish-e-Mohammed, claimed responsibility. Pakistan rejected charges it was responsible in any way for the bombing. The Egyptian parliament has cleared the way for President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to rule Egypt until 2034. Human rights groups in Egypt denounced the move, saying it'll permit al-Sisi to, quote, retain power for life and exercise unprecedented unilateral authority, unquote. Since coming to office following the 2013 coup, al-Sisi has imprisoned thousands of his critics. Last year, the former military general won a widely criticized election where he received 97% of the vote after all his main opponents were jailed or forced to drop out. Soon after last year's vote, President Trump called al-Sisi to congratulate him on his re-election. The Department of Health and Human Services has launched a probe of the Indian Health Service over its mishandling of a doctor accused of pedophilia. The doctor, Stanley Patrick Weber, was the focus of a recent investigation by PBS Frontline and the Wall Street Journal. In 1995, Indian Health Service officials concluded Weber was molesting children, but the agency allowed him to keep working for another 21 years, continually transferring him from reservation to reservation. He was eventually convicted in 2018 and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. In news from Washington, D.C., Ryan Zinke has joined the lobbying firm Turnberry Solutions just weeks after stepping down as Interior Secretary. He becomes the first former Trump cabinet official to join a lobbying firm. Shortly after taking office, President Trump signed an executive order that purported to ban White House officials from lobbying for 5 years. But according to ProPublica, at least 33 former Trump officials have managed to sidestep the ethics pledge. Trump's former campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, is also joining Turnberry Solutions with Zinke. The American Civil Liberties Union and a group of other civil rights groups have sued the Trump administration over its new policy forcing asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while the United States processes their asylum claims. Melissa Crow of the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is part of the suit, said, quote, this misguided policy deprives vulnerable individuals of humanitarian protections that have been on the books for decades and puts their lives in jeopardy, she said. The Oregonian newspaper is reporting federal law enforcement officials have launched an investigation after a number of Saudi students living in the United States vanished while they were facing serious criminal charges, including manslaughter and rape. The paper found that in at least 4 cases, the Saudi government paid the defendants bail and legal fees before they disappeared. In one case, police believe Saudi officials snuck a Saudi national out of the country on a private plane using a fake passport so he could avoid being tried for killing a 15-year-old Portland teenager in a hit-and-run. The Democratic National Committee has announced the first debate of the 2020 presidential primary cycle will be held over 2 consecutive nights in June. As many as 20 candidates could take part. The DNC said candidates will need to garner at least 1% support in 3 separate polls to qualify or obtain 65,000 unique donors and a minimum of 200 donors per state in at least 20 states. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. With 1 day left to pass a government spending bill before tonight's midnight deadline to avert another government shutdown, both the House and Senate passed the measure Thursday that came out of the bipartisan conference committee earlier this week. The bill includes nearly $1.4 billion to build 55 miles of new border barriers out of steel, far less than the $5.7 billion requested by President Trump. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell took to the Senate floor Thursday to announce President Trump's decision to sign the spending bill. As some had speculated and many Democrats feared, McConnell confirmed Trump's plan to declare a national emergency in an attempt to circumvent Congress for his $5.7 billion in border wall funding.
I've just had an opportunity to speak with President Trump, and he, I would say to all my colleagues, has indicated he's prepared to sign the bill. He will also be issuing a national emergency declaration at the same time. And I've indicated to him that I'm going to support the national emergency declaration. So for all of my colleagues, the president will sign the bill. We'll be voting on it shortly.
McConnell's vow of support came despite reports that he warned Trump against the move, saying it could split the Republican Party and prompt a resolution disapproving the emergency declaration. Democrats quickly condemned the news. This is House Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
Did I ever say I was filing a legal challenge?
You said Democrats.
I may. That's an option, and we'll review our options. But it's important to note that when the president declares this emergency, first of all, it's not an emergency, what's happening at the border. It's a humanitarian challenge to us. The president has tried to sell a bill of goods to American people. But putting that aside, just in terms of the president making an end run around Congress,
Trump is set to speak this morning at 10 a.m. if he declares a national emergency. The consumer rights nonprofit Public Citizen has vowed legal action against him, saying the move, quote, will constitute an outrageous abuse of power, perhaps the most dangerous yet, by the unstable and increasingly autocratic President Trump, unquote. For more, we're joined right now by the CEO of the president of Public Citizen, Robert Weissman. Welcome to Democracy Now!
It's great to be with you.
So, Rob, talk about what your plans are for today.
Well, we're going to see what happens if the president actually goes forward and issues this outrageous emergency declaration. If he does, we're prepared to sue to block the declaration. And we're also going to be working on our own and with hundreds of allies to get Congress to pass a resolution to disapprove the emergency declaration, which it has the ability to do.
So explain what this national emergency resolution would do.
Well, we don't know, and we're not going to know until the president acts, but it seems as what he's going to claim is that there is a national emergency at the border and that, therefore, he can move money around that has not been appropriated for the purposes of building the racist wall to, in fact, build the racist wall. There is a legal structure in place for how to declare an emergency, and the president does have authority under other laws to move money around if, in fact, there is a national emergency. So we're going to sue, again, based on what he does, but challenging the idea that there's an emergency and also challenging whether the way he's moving the money is legal under the statutes that exist. But the real big issue is going to be whether people turn out in droves to protest this and say, not only do we not want a wall, but we don't want the president declaring emergencies to get around the will of Congress. If this president is able to declare an emergency to build a wall around a fictitious claim of urgency, against the express interests of the intent of Congress, there's really no limit to what he might do in the future with an emergency declaration. People might think this sounds really scary, almost like martial law. They should think it sounds really scary, and they should act appropriately.
So what can Congress do? I mean, it doesn't only have to come through a lawsuit, the challenge.
That's right. So under the National Emergencies Act, Congress has express authority to pass a resolution of disapproval for the emergency declaration. I think the House is going to move pretty quickly to do that. If the House does it, the Senate must consider it. So this is going to come up in the Senate.
Let me go to Joaquin Castro, the Congress member from Texas, in his conversation with CNN, who said he would file a resolution to block Trump's declaration of national emergency.
I don't think that it's a national emergency. I think this would be a fake emergency. If you look at the active national emergencies right now, those mostly revolve around national security issues. And so I'm prepared, if the president does declare a national emergency to build his border wall, to file a joint resolution under the National Emergencies Act that would essentially terminate his declaration. And we would have a vote either on my resolution or somebody else's on the House floor. And then it's my understanding that that resolution would have to be voted upon in the Senate. And there have been very critical comments that have been made by senators, including Republican senators, about the president's ability and the wisdom of declaring a national emergency for this purpose.
And House Speaker Nancy Pelosi warned about that by calling an unwarranted national emergency, Trump is setting a precedent for future presidents.
You want to talk about a national emergency? Let's talk about today, the one-year anniversary of another manifestation of the epidemic of gun violence in America. That's a national emergency. Why don't you declare that emergency, Mr. President? I wish you would. But a Democratic president can do that. Democratic president can declare emergencies as well. So the precedent that the president is setting here is something that should be met with great unease and dismay.
So that's House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Robert Weissman.
Right. So I think Castro is describing the process that's going to go forward. And he's right to say, I assume this will pass the House, a resolution of disapproval. But it really might also pass the Senate. There have been a number of Republicans who say they're worried about this, and they're going to be tested to see whether they stand with their principal or whether they stand with their party's president. And we're going to find out. Now, if it does pass by majority in the Senate as well, Trump can veto the resolution. Then it would require 2/3 in both houses to override that veto. That'll be pretty tough. But it's still very significant if, in fact, he's forced to veto a resolution of disapproval. Pelosi is speaking to the implications of a national emergency. She's sending a message to Republicans saying, look, if you think you're going to be able to get away with this and our side's not going to use this, think again. And in ways that are very foreseeable, much more grounded in reality, like climate change, an actual global emergency of the highest proportion. Be careful what you wish for. What I'm most worried about is this president doing it, not just this time, but again. It's easy to imagine him declaring a national emergency to ban public protest and deploy the military domestically. He might trump up claims, as it were, about gang violence, and we suddenly have sweeps of people of color communities around the country. Those extreme scenarios, they're not so extreme with this president, and whether or not they might move forward depends both on how the national emergency is treated in the courts, but especially by how it's received by the American people in Congress.
And what do you think about the courts, what they would do?
It's up for grabs, is the answer. I mean, we think...
Has Mitch McConnell changed the courts enough at this point with the scores of conservative judges he has pushed through?
Well, there's two parts to it. One is the law is fairly ambiguous. When Congress passed the National Emergencies Act and other emergency statutes, they really didn't have in mind Trump. They sort of expected people who would use the law in good faith. And more or less, that's what's occurred in the past. So the president does have some pretty broad latitude under the statute to define what's an emergency. We think even so, in this case, it's plainly not an emergency. There's not really any problem. It has no sense of urgency, and the president's powers in this regard are at his lowest ebb because he's trying to change spending decisions that Congress has made. So there's the first is the legal question, which is not clear-cut. And then there's the background of the courts. And even if it were clear-cut, it would be a mistake to assume that the Supreme Court at the end of the day is going to side with civil liberties or separation of powers or really anything else other than President Trump.
I want to ask you about something else. I want to turn to President Trump's selection of David Bernhardt as Secretary of the Interior. Bernhardt, a former oil lobbyist, has been the agency's acting secretary since Ryan Zinke stepped down in December amidst multiple scandals and ethics violations. Bernhardt was confirmed as Deputy Secretary of the Interior in 2017, where he helped roll back regulations overseen by the department. He worked to make the approval for land and offshore drilling projects easier and proposed limiting protections for endangered species. Bernhardt also ordered some furloughed workers back to work during the government shutdown to push through on oil and natural gas drilling permits, offshore drilling and drilling in the Alaska refuge, according to an ethics complaint of Public Citizen. With the Interior Department's ethics official and Inspector General, Bernhardt appears to have violated Trump's executive order barring officials from working on any issues they had lobbied on in the 2 years prior to joining the administration. Rob Weissman, can you talk about what you have on Bernhardt and what you think needs to happen?
Well, this is one of just the most amazing but now normalized features of the Trump administration. What we've seen in agency after agency is they have a scandal at the cabinet level. The cabinet official is forced out, and it's always been a he, is replaced by a lobbyist. So their response to ethics challenges in the Trump administration is to hire lobbyists who worked on the agency that they're now going to be in charge of. That happened at EPA, where there's a coal lobbyist in charge, replacing Pruitt. It happened at HHS, the Health and Human Services Department, where Tom Price was replaced by a former executive of a drug company. And now at the Department of Interior, where an oil lobbyist comes in to take over for Ryan Zinke, who, as you just mentioned, by the way, leaves the department and goes and becomes a lobbyist himself. This guy, Bernhardt...
With the former campaign manager for Corey Lewandowski.
That's right.
Corey Lewandowski for Trump.
It's hard to keep track of all the moving pieces, but if you just assume it's as corrupt as you could possibly imagine and double it, you'll usually land right. So with Bernhardt, among the other things he had done before coming into government is a lobby on the Clean Water Act, which he is now inside government tried to roll back. We had actually filed an earlier complaint against Bernhardt because he's also previously been, we knew, in violation of Trump's supposed ethics rules. And now with this new information about his lobbying on the Clean Water Act, it's very clear he's working on the exact same issue that he'd worked on as a lobbyist outside of government.
Well, Rob Weissman, I want to thank you for being with us. President of Public Citizen, the group has said it'll sue President Trump if he declares a national emergency to secure funding for his border wall. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we get response from immigrants' rights activist Erica Andiola on the passage of the bill and President Trump's threats. Stay with us. Mad World featuring Gary Jules. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from Washington, D.C. President Trump's expected to declare a national emergency today to build a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border despite opposition from Congress. On Thursday, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell announced Trump planned to sign the latest spending bill, but to also declare a national emergency. The bill includes nearly $1.4 billion to build 55 miles of new border barriers out of steel, far less than the $5.7 billion requested by President Trump. Democratic Congress members Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, and Rashida Tlaib issued a statement that they voted against the bill because it gives more funding to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That's ICE. Well, for more, we're joined via Democracy Now! Video stream by Erica Andiola, Chief Advocacy Officer for RACIS, the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services. Erica, thanks so much for joining us from West Virginia. Can you talk about what the bill that is about to be signed and then President Trump's threat?
Yeah, for me, is very alarming, very, very alarming to see that this president is about to use a national emergency as a political card, basically, to try to get this wall, which we know it's not going to do anything to actually solve the problem that is happening at the border. The problem that's happening at the border, it's been said over and over again that is humanitarian. And what does that mean? That there's human beings literally right now trying to figure out how to ask asylum in this country, which is legal. And so it's definitely alarming, and I really hope that we can rise up if he does this, because we can't continue to let him do this.
So, Erica, talk about the Congress members like Joaquin Castro, who represents the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. They're voting against the legislation, and why?
Yeah, which is the right thing to do, and that is because, we need at least, we've been pushing for Democrats to actually do the right thing, to stop playing his games. He's been, using this. He's been using this basically for political purposes. We saw when the elections were happening in 2018, where all of a sudden the caravan was this huge threat, and then the elections are over and there's nothing else about the caravan coming out of Trump's mouth, right after November. And so we have seen that this is a political stunt. And the most alarming thing is that we have, what worries me is that we have Democrats actually playing his game, trying to give him more money for DHS, trying to give him more money, which can be, and I assure you, will be used to continue to detain people. And so we have to make sure that we push back and that we let Democrats know that this is a time to stand up against Trump, and everything that he's trying to do, because at the end of the day, he's going to push for what he wants. And we are seeing this right now.
Erica, the showdown over Trump's border wall comes as riot police in northern Mexico blocked hundreds of desperate Central American migrants Wednesday as they tried to escape an abandoned factory complex where they've been imprisoned while waiting for the U.S. to process their asylum claims. More than 1,700 migrants have been held in the Maquiladora in the Mexican border town of Piedras Negras since February 5th. After they arrived in a caravan of people seeking asylum in the United States, the vast majority have remained prisoners at the site after the Trump administration adopted a Remain in Mexico policy for asylum seekers, processing just 15 asylum applications per day at the nearby Eagle Pass border crossing. This is one of the migrants speaking with your group, RACIS.
We are not allowed to go outside. They have locked us up as prisoners. We need organizations to support us with hats and gloves, or with bedding and scarves. That's what we need, because the cold is tremendous. And the real truth is that there are children here. There are sick people. There are seniors. And the truth is, we're in an abandoned factory, and now we are using it as a shelter.
Because the person was afraid of being identified. RACIS was also able to speak with a child being held there just outside the facility. This is an excerpt.
My name is Anna, and I'm 10 years old. I'm from Honduras. What is happening here? Well, I want everyone to listen to what I'm going to say right now. I do not want to be here. They need to let us out of here because it's really ugly. I don't like it. It's very confined, and there are lots of diseases. The doctors don't pay attention to us. Nothing. We came to the doctor yesterday, and they told us there were no pills. There are no pills every day. For Mom, there are never any pills. That's why my mom gets angry. They don't let us go outside if we don't go out with that piece of paper. They won't let us go out. We want to go to the convenience store, but we can't. And here, we can't sleep very well because they don't turn the lights off. Yesterday, I went to bed at 1 a.m. My mom is sick. They don't let us sleep, and there's so much noise here. That's why my mom does not want to be here.
Talk about this situation, Erica Andiola.
Yeah, it's really hard to hear this 10-year-old girl. So I'm getting a little emotional. I apologize, but this is the actual urgency. We have children and elderly and human beings right now who are in this old factory in Mexico, being surrounded by Mexican police. They don't know what's going on. Raíces, our team, has been on the ground trying to figure out how we can best support them. They're not letting us inside the shelter, and not everybody's able to come out of the shelter unless they have a humanitarian visa from Mexico. And so, we have heard a lot of stories, like Anna's, of people who right now are trying to get out of there, trying to buy food outside, trying to get, women trying to get, necessities for them. And so for us, it's important to at least get in there and give them some information on what's going on, because they have no idea what the process is. They have no idea how long they're going to be there. And, they know that they can come and knock on the door and ask for asylum. But, we can't really assess, or we can't really give them advice on what they could possibly do, because they're not letting us inside. They're basically in this prison. And so that is the actual humanitarian crisis that is happening. And I hope that, this little girl and all these folks who are actually telling their stories can actually touch the hearts of some of the politicians here. I'm pretty sure they're not going to touch Trump's heart, but at least, like I said, Democrats can hear this and see that giving them more money to this, to this administration, it's not going to do anything.
Erica Andiola, we want to thank you for being with us, Chief Advocacy Officer for ISIS, the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the nation's capital, from Washington, D.C. Well, this Black History Month marks the 201st birthday of the renowned abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Douglass was born into slavery in 1818, it is believed. He died a free man in 1895. That's known. On July 5th, 1852, in Rochester, New York, Douglass gave one of his most famous speeches, the meaning of the 4th of July to the American Negro. He was addressing the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. This is an excerpt of James Earl Jones reading the historic address during a performance of Howard Zinn's Voices of a People's History of the United States.
It is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and the crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced.
James Earl Jones reading the speech of Frederick Douglass. Well, last night, leaders from around the country gathered at the Library of Congress here in Washington, D.C., to honor the life and legacy of Frederick Douglass. The ceremony was the culmination of a year of events marking the bicentennial of the birth of the celebrated abolitionist, politician, writer, feminist, educator, entrepreneur, and diplomat. We're joined now by Kenneth Morris, Jr., Frederick Douglass's great-great-great-grandson. He's here in Washington, D.C. to celebrate his ancestors' remarkable legacy. Kenneth Morris, Jr. is the co-founder and president of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, also the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you, Amy.
What a legacy. What a legacy.
Wow.
So especially for young people. Tell us about Frederick Douglass. Tell us about his life history and what he would have felt about what's happening today.
Well, he was born into slavery, as you said, sometime in 1818. He was born to an enslaved woman and to a white man, and it was presumed that his master was his father. And he had an opportunity in his life where he was taken from the eastern shore of Maryland to be the house servant for his master's brother. And the reason I say it was an opportunity was because when he got there, his slave mistress had never had a slave before and didn't know that it was illegal to teach him. She begins to teach him his ABCs. His master finds out, gets angry, forbids the lessons, but that was all that Frederick Douglass needed, was that little spark of knowledge into his mental darkness. He would teach himself to read and write over the objections of his overseers, escaped slavery at the age of 20 in 1838. He would go on to become an advisor to President Lincoln. He was an ambassador and consul general to Haiti, first African-American U.S. Marshal, and the list goes on, and would pass away in 1895 in his home in Washington, D.C.
And talk about the mark he made, the fight against slavery, the fight, really a leading advocate of women's rights and women's suffrage.
When he first published his autobiography, The Narrative, in 1845, it became a bestseller, and the notoriety from the book threatened his freedom because he was still a fugitive at the time, at the age of 27, and he had to flee to Europe for a couple of years as a cooling-off period. And when he was in Europe, he spent some time in Ireland and came into contact with the great Irish liberator Daniel O'Connell. And Daniel O'Connell really helped Frederick Douglass to understand that about human rights and to fight for human rights for everyone. When he would return back to the United States after his abolitionist friends paid for his freedom from his master, he came back with a different mindset, an internationalist mindset to fighting for human rights for everybody. And this is why you see him become one of the first statesmen of any race to fight for women's rights and women's suffrage and to speak out for the rights of immigrants and many other disenfranchised groups.
Well, in 2017, Donald Trump seemed to suggest he thought Frederick Douglass was still alive. This is Trump speaking at a Black History Month event 2 years ago.
I am very proud now that we have a museum in the National Mall where people can learn about Reverend King, so many other things. Frederick Douglass is an example of somebody who's done an amazing job and is being recognized more and more, I notice.
He notices. That was President Trump. It might have been encouraging for you to know, Kenneth, that your great-great-great-grandfather was still alive.
Well, it would have been nice because I've always looked forward to meeting him. And so had he still been alive, that would have been a great thing. But the last time that the two of us were together, we talked about that 2 years ago. And that really has been the gift that keeps on giving.
You're talking about me and you, not you and President Trump.
Yes, that's correct. The gift that keeps on giving, because it really put his name out there into the public consciousness. And many people know the name Frederick Douglass, but they don't necessarily know what he did or what his contributions were to the country. So there was good and bad that came from that, but as far as our work, the name recognition has really helped us to advance the work in the bicentennial year.
You're moving your institute to Rochester, New York. Why?
Frederick Douglass spent 25 years of his life there. He published the North Star newspaper there, which was the leading abolitionist voice. It's where he chose to be buried in Mount Hope Cemetery. And it is really time for the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives and the family of Frederick Douglass to return back to the city that he loved so much. We've been able to develop some great relationships in the community. During the bicentennial year, we worked on a project where we erected 13 statues of Frederick Douglass all around the city at sites that were significant in his life.
Was one of the statues of Frederick Douglass recently vandalized?
It was vandalized, and it's interesting that the site where that statue was vandalized by two students at St. John's Fisher College was the site where a school stood where Frederick and Anna's oldest daughter was enrolled, but she was forced to be segregated from the rest of her classmates. Then eventually Frederick would take her out of the school. So it was interesting that this racist act of tearing down this statue was at the site where Rosetta had suffered racism and segregation.
What do you want to leave people with as we come out of February 14th is the day you've chosen to celebrate your great-great-great-grandfather's birthday, but especially young people today.
Yeah, well, that's the date that he chose for his birthday. He only saw his mother 4 times his whole life, and she used to call him her little Valentine. So when he was looking for a day to celebrate his birthday, he chose February 14th. But what we would hope young people would take away, I think, is a great story. When Frederick Douglass was near the end of his life at his home here in the Anacostia neighborhood of Washington, D.C., he loved to walk around the street and interact with the kids. And there was a young man that walked up to him and said, "What advice would you give to a person that's looking to fight for justice and fight for equality?" And without hesitation, Frederick said, "Agitate, agitate, agitate." And he was always agitating. And, of course, in the political climate that we're in right now with the divisiveness and the rhetoric, it's really important that activists and young people understand that they can lift their voices and agitate.
And talk about the significance of him being one of the most photographed people back then.
I find it amazing. He was 22 years old, only 2 years removed from slavery, never having spent one day of his life in a classroom. He understood that this new technology, photography, could help him make his arguments for liberation and equality. And he understood that he could present himself in the public as a man worthy of freedom, worthy of citizenship. And if we think about the visuals of Frederick Douglass and his intense steely glare in those photographs, especially the young years, he did that intentionally because he said, "I never want to look like a happy, amiable fugitive slave." He's trying to shatter the notion in the public consciousness that these were people of African descent that were not worthy of freedom or citizenship, and perhaps they were better off in slavery, make them an other to justify brutalizing them, exploiting them, and dehumanizing them.
Well, Kenneth Morris, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Kenneth Morris, Jr. is the co-founder and president of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass. We'll have you back to talk about your other ancestor. You are also the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. This is Democracy Now!, but when we come back, we'll be joined by American University professor Ibram X. Kendi. Stay with us.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming but carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming but carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, come but carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, come but carry me home. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Coming but carry me home, a band of angels coming after me, coming but carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming but carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot.
Swing Low by Paul Robeson. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we continue to celebrate the remarkable life and legacy of Frederick Douglass on his 201st birthday. We're joined now by Ibram X. Kendi, professor of history and international relations at American University, founding director of its Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center. Professor Kendi spoke last night at the Library of Congress at an event honoring Frederick Douglass, where he quoted the renowned abolitionist who once said, quote, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle." Those are the words of Frederick Douglass, quoted by Ibram X. Kendi, who is a National Book Award-winning author of Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, his forthcoming book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. He's also a contributing editor at The Atlantic magazine. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be on the show.
How does Frederick Douglass inspire you in this week of the anniversary of his birth?
Well, I think that many people are trying to sort of imagine how to bring about a new world based on everything that's been happening in recent years. And Frederick Douglass constantly sort of told us that the road is not going to be easy, but the road must be a road of struggle. And so for me, he constantly sort of tells me, as you sort of mentioned in that iconic sort of message, that we have to struggle and we can never stop struggling. And the only way that we will be defeated is if we stop struggling.
I want to ask you about what's happening in Virginia right now. The top three embattled officials of Virginia, starting with Governor Northam. The Democratic governor continues to resist mounting calls for his resignation after a photograph appeared on his medical school yearbook page that showed a man in Ku Klux Klan garb next to a man in blackface. At first, Governor Northam apologized for this, suggesting he was one of these two men, and then he said it wasn't him, although he did wear blackface to impersonate Michael Jackson at another point that same year. Can you respond to what this means? You had a very interesting piece on blackface and suggestions for what Governor Northam should read, not to mention what he should do right now.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, like many people, that he should resign, and that, for a very long time, African Americans and other Americans have felt offended from blackface, felt as if Americans weren't listening to them as we told them that this was not certainly something that should be going on. And now African Americans in Virginia and other Americans are calling on the governor to resign, and he's not sort of respecting them in that way either. But if he decides to stay into office and he decides to take up more of a racial equality platform as his advisors are suggesting, then I think he should embrace that fully and truly seek to be an anti-racist governor and truly seek to look at the racist policies that are causing all of the racial inequities in his state. But first and foremost, he should seek to recognize how and why blackface is so offensive by going on a binge of reading of anti-racist texts. So I sort of offered some of those texts he could read.
What are some of those texts?
Oh, man. So, I mean, he could, of course, start out with some political memoirs and the autobiography of Malcolm X, or Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Cage Book Sings. He can read essays like Between the World and Me, or even The Fire.
By Ta-Nehisi Coates?
Yeah, by Ta-Nehisi Coates, or The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, or The Fire This Time by Jesmyn Ward, her anthology. Or he can read books on slavery, and so, I mean, I think there's so many texts that he could read if he was seriously interested in learning about racism in this country.
So you have just finished a book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. How?
I think first and foremost for us to recognize there's no such thing as a not racist, And so typically when Americans are charged with expressing racist ideas or defending racist policies, Americans like to respond by saying, I'm not a racist. And I have yet to figure out what it means to be a not racist. And so I think first and foremost for Americans to stop being in denial about their racist ideas, about the policies that are causing racial disparities, and recognize that there's only racist and anti-racist ideas, notions of racial hierarchy and notions of racial equality. There are only racist and anti-racist policies that yield racial equity and policies that yield racial inequity. And then there are only people who are supporting either or both. And so I think for us, first and foremost, to recognize that there's no such thing as a not racist, and for us to recognize we can only be racist or anti-racist.
Professor Kendi, you wrote a beautiful piece in The Atlantic magazine about, well, this period, this last year that you've been writing your book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. You also went through a health crisis yourself, being diagnosed with fourth-stage metastatic colon cancer, over a year ago?
Yes.
88% of people don't make it. Talk about the diagnosis and how you came through this.
Yeah, so I mean, around this time last year, I think January 10th of last year, I had a colonoscopy, and we were shocked when the doctor came in and said that she saw something abnormal, which she thought was cancer, and then the next day they scanned my body and found that colon cancer had spread to my liver. And there were tumors in my liver. And so I think I was 35 years old, I was completely shocked. I didn't have any of the risk factors. But at the same time, they said there was a chance, a chance that I could recover. And so, of course, I did 6 months of chemotherapy, and almost immediately the tumors started to shrink. And ultimately, I did surgery at the end of the summer, and the surgeons went in and found that there were no cancer cells left. And for me, the way that I got through that process was more or less sort of thinking about writing, of course, the book, but even sort of thinking about what was possible. I mean, I tried to really appreciate the little things in life and just know that if there's a possibility, then I want to be that possibility.
You had a little girl.
Yes.
When you were diagnosed, how old was she?
She was about 1. Yeah.
So how did it change your views? You wrote in the piece, the more my fear of death changed into the wonder of survival, the more I reflected on what I was writing. If I could live on, why not live on to be anti-racist? Why not live to be fully human and see all others as fully human, and fight to ensure our policies see and treat all humans fully and equitably?
Yeah, I mean, it really, in many ways, the cancer diagnosis and the fight, and of course it was extremely difficult going through 6 months of chemo privately, but I think for me, it allowed me to recognize just how precious our time is on this earth, just how short our time is on this earth, and just how serious we should be about our time on this earth. And so for me, that's what it really was. I mean, we need to take every moment that we have on this earth seriously. And for me, that seriousness was trying to create a new anti-racist world.
You talked about a kind of cocoon of women around you, your little girl, your partner, and your mother.
Yes. Yeah, so my mother, when we told her that I more than likely had cancer, her response was, well, we'll deal with it. And that was it. And that's typically how she responded to adversity, that we'll deal with it. And so, for me, I was like, okay, we will deal with it. And my partner as well, who's a physician and who knew how serious it was. I didn't even know that 88% of people with stage 4 colon cancer are basically dying, but she knew. But she, of course, was extremely supportive throughout. And then my daughter, who, of course, didn't know what was going on and expected her daddy to be acting the same way, even if I got chemotherapy earlier in the day. And so how could I not act the same way?
So how does it feel to be part of the 12%?
It feels good. And of course, I'd like to continue to be in that. 12%.
Well, it is a pleasure to spend this time with you, and we look forward to interviewing you in your book when it comes out this summer.
Thank you.
Ibram X. Kendi, Professor of History and International Relations, Founding Director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University. I'm Amy Goodman in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much.